My perfect affair ended when both men showed up at my award ceremony. Imagine standing on stage accepting the biggest honor of your career, only to see your husband and your lover in the same audience, both realizing your secret. What happens when two worlds collide and there's no escape? Subscribe for more. The applause was deafening, a thunderous roar of admiration from colleagues, friends, and strangers. I stood on the brightly lit stage, clutching a crystal award in my trembling hands, the microphone only inches away as I tried to form words. But I couldn't speak. I couldn't breathe. Because sitting in the audience, both staring at me, were my husband, Daniel, and my lover, James. I didn't even know how it had come to this. Just moments ago, I was soaring on cloud nine. The entire evening had been a celebration of my hard work, years of effort, late nights, and sacrifices to achieve this moment. The keynote speaker had just delivered a glowing introduction about me, about how I was the epitome of excellence and integrity. Irony, it seemed, had a cruel sense of humor. My eyes darted from one man to the other. Daniel's face was a mask of confusion and suspicion, his brows furrowed as he leaned forward in his chair. James, on the other hand, looked calm, almost smug, like he had anticipated this moment all along. His sharp navy suit was impeccable, and the slight smirk tugging at his lips only made my stomach twist tighter. He was enjoying this. My heart pounded as I struggled to speak into the microphone. Thank you, I stammered, forcing a smile that I hoped looked genuine. The crowd continued to cheer, oblivious to the personal disaster unraveling in front of me. When I glanced back at Daniel, he was leaning over to whisper something to the woman seated next to him, a coworker of mine who had invited him tonight without my knowledge. He shouldn't have been here. He was supposed to be on a business trip. Panic rose in my chest as I realized there was no way to avoid the confrontation that was surely coming. James caught my eye again and winked. That subtle, cocky gesture sent a flash of anger and fear through me. He knew exactly what he was doing. He knew that Daniel's presence would complicate everything, and yet he had come anyway. Was this his way of staking a claim? Of forcing me to choose? The rest of the ceremony blurred together. I couldn't remember the speeches, the photos, or even walking off the stage. My body moved on autopilot, shaking hands, smiling, and pretending that everything was perfectly fine. But inside, my thoughts were spiraling out of control. By the time I made it to the reception area, I spotted Daniel heading straight for me, his expression dark and unreadable. My chest tightened. I could already feel the weight of his questions pressing down on me, suffocating me. How was I going to explain James? How could I lie my way out of this? Before Daniel could reach me, James appeared at my side. He slid an arm around my waist, his touch both familiar and possessive. "You were incredible up there," he murmured, his breath warm against my ear. I stiffened, glancing around to see if anyone was watching. "James, what are you doing?" I hissed, trying to pull away. But he held firm, his grip a silent reminder that I had let this go too far. "Relax," he said, his voice calm and infuriatingly confident. "I just wanted to congratulate you in person. You deserve this." His lips brushed against my temple and I froze, knowing that Daniel was watching. I could feel his gaze like a laser, burning into me from across the room. "Let go of me," I demanded, shoving James away. He raised his hands in mock surrender, his smirk never faltering. "Fine, but you can't avoid this forever." I didn't have time to respond before Daniel reached us. "Who's this?" he asked, his tone clipped and cold. His eyes darted between James and me, suspicion hardening his features. I opened my mouth to answer, but no sound came out. James extended a hand, his smile widening. "James Carter, a close friend of your wife's." Daniel didn't shake his hand. Instead, he turned to me, his expression demanding answers. "A close friend?" he repeated, his voice heavy with disbelief. "Since when?" My heart pounded as I scrambled for an explanation, but James beat me to it. We met at a conference last year, he said smoothly, as if rehearsed. She's one of the most brilliant minds I've ever worked with. That's enough, I snapped, glaring at James. He simply shrugged, the picture of nonchalance. I'll see you later, he said, his voice laced with meaning, and then he walked away, leaving me to face Daniel alone. Care to explain what that was about? Daniel asked, his voice low and dangerous. His jaw was clenched, his fists tight at his sides. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my trembling hands. He's just a colleague, I lied, the words tasting bitter on my tongue. He wanted to congratulate me, that's all. Just a colleague, Daniel repeated, his eyes narrowing. 'Cause that didn't look like just a colleague. The noise of the reception buzzed around us, but all I could hear was the deafening silence between us. I opened my mouth to deny it again, but the weight of my lies was crushing me. How much longer could I keep this up? Seraph, 1,000 words. The morning sunlight streamed through the windows of my home office, casting a warm glow on the walls lined with books and awards. To an outsider, my life looked perfect. I was a successful professional, respected in my field, and married to a man most women would envy. Daniel was charming, intelligent, and ambitious, a partner who shared my drive for success. But behind the carefully curated facade, our marriage was a shadow of what it once was. It wasn't always this way. When Daniel and I first met, we were inseparable. Our shared dreams and ambitions brought us together, and for years we were each other's greatest supporters. But as time passed, his career began to consume him. Late nights at the office turned into weekend trips, and our conversations became increasingly transactional, discussing schedules, bills, and logistics instead of hopes and dreams. We lived under the same roof but in separate worlds. I poured myself into my work, seeking fulfillment in my career that I no longer found in my marriage. It was easier that way, easier than admitting that I was lonely, that I missed the man I married. But no matter how many accolades I received, they couldn't fill the emptiness I felt at home. Then, at a networking event last year, I met James. He was magnetic, with an easy charm that drew people in. When he introduced himself, his confidence was palpable, his smile disarming. He had a way of making you feel like you were the only person in the room, and for someone who had spent years feeling invisible, his attention was intoxicating. At first, it was innocent. We exchanged business cards, followed each other on LinkedIn, and kept in touch through the occasional email. But over time, our messages became more personal, our conversations more frequent. He made me laugh in a way I hadn't in years, and I found myself looking forward to his texts more than I cared to admit. It wasn't until our paths crossed again at a conference in Chicago that things began to change. We spent hours talking over dinner, sharing stories about our careers and personal lives. He listened in a way that Daniel hadn't in years, his eyes never leaving mine. When he walked me back to my hotel that night, the electricity between us was undeniable. "Can I see you again?" he asked, his voice low and inviting. I hesitated, knowing the answer should be no. But as I looked into his eyes, I felt a pull I couldn't resist. "Yes," I whispered, sealing my fate with a single word. From that moment on, my life became a balancing act, juggling two identities, the devoted wife and the woman who craved something more. I told myself it wasn't hurting anyone, that I could keep the two worlds separate. But deep down, I knew it was only a matter of time before they collided. The weeks after that fateful night in Chicago blurred into a whirlwind of carefully crafted deceit. My days were a routine of spreadsheets, meetings, and presentations, while my evenings, when Daniel was away or too exhausted to notice, were spent texting James or secretly meeting him when work trips conveniently overlapped. James was the kind of man who demanded attention. His confidence, his unapologetic nature, and the way he made me feel like the most important person in the room, it was magnetic. Every time we met, I felt alive in a way I hadn't in years. It wasn't just his physical presence, though that was intoxicating enough. It was the way he listened, really listened, as though my every word mattered. With him, I wasn't just Daniel's wife or the overachiever at work. I was me. But the guilt was there too. It lingered in the quiet moments, like when Daniel would sit next to me on the couch, his laptop open as he worked late into the night. He was oblivious to my inner turmoil, his focus entirely on the latest numbers from his firm. Sometimes I would glance at him and wonder if he could sense it, if he could see the changes in me. Yet Daniel's distance made it easy to rationalize my actions. I told myself that I deserved this, that I wasn't hurting anyone because Daniel and I were already so far apart. But the lies I told myself began to multiply. Small things at first, an extra work meeting here, a late-night call there. Before long, my web of excuses grew so tangled that I started to lose track of them. One Saturday morning, Daniel suggested we go for a hike, something we used to love doing together before life got too busy. I felt a pang of guilt, but I was also desperate for something, anything that might bring us closer again. So I agreed. We walked through the woods in silence, the crunch of leaves underfoot the only sound between us. The tension was suffocating. Finally, Daniel broke the silence. "Are you happy?" he asked, his voice quiet but firm. The question caught me off guard, and I stumbled over my answer. "Of course I am. Why would you ask that?" He stopped walking and turned to face me, his eyes searching mine. "I don't know," he said. "You just seem different lately, like you're somewhere else." My heart pounded as I scrambled for an explanation. "Work's been stressful," I said, forcing a smile. "It's nothing." He nodded, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. For a moment, I considered telling him the truth. Not about James, but about how lonely I had felt, how disconnected we had become. But the words caught in my throat. Instead, I squeezed his hand and kept walking, the moment slipping away like sand through my fingers. As the months went on, the affair with James deepened. We developed a rhythm, a routine of secret rendezvous and stolen moments. I became an expert at compartmentalizing, locking away the guilt when I was with him and pretending everything was normal when I was at home with Daniel. But there were close calls, moments that made my heart stop and my pulse race, like the time James left a voicemail on my phone and Daniel nearly heard it, or the day I came home wearing a bracelet James had given me, only to have Daniel notice it and ask where it came from. This?" I said, fumbling for an answer. "One of the girls at work gave it to me as a thank you gift." Daniel raised an eyebrow but didn't press further. I made a mental note to be more careful. James, for his part, seemed unfazed by the risks. In fact, I sometimes wondered if he enjoyed the thrill of it all. He would tease me about my double life, his tone playful, but with an edge of something darker. "You're addicted to this," he said one evening as we lay tangled in the sheets of a hotel room. To me, I wanted to deny it, but I couldn't. He was right. I was addicted to the excitement, the escape, the way he made me feel. But I also knew it couldn't last. Sooner or later, something would give. One evening, Daniel came home earlier than expected. I was in the middle of texting James when I heard the sound of his car pulling into the driveway. Panic surged through me as I quickly deleted the message and tucked my phone away. "Hey," Daniel said as he walked through the door, his briefcase in one hand and a bouquet of flowers in the other. "I thought I'd surprise you." I blinked, caught off guard. "What's the occasion?" "Do I need one?" he said, handing me the flowers with a sheepish smile. "I just figured we could use a night to ourselves." My stomach churned with guilt as I took the bouquet from him. As I arranged the flowers in a vase, I couldn't help but feel the weight of my deception pressing down on me. Daniel was trying in his own way to reconnect, but I had already drifted too far. A few weeks later, the invitation to the award ceremony arrived. It was a prestigious event, one that recognized the top professionals in my field. I was thrilled to be nominated, though a part of me felt unworthy. How could I stand on that stage and accept an award when my personal life was such a mess? I debated whether to invite Daniel. On one hand, I knew it would mean a lot to him to be there. On the other, I wasn't sure I could handle the pressure of having him in the same room as James, who had already told me he would be attending. In the end, I decided not to tell Daniel about the ceremony. I told myself it was to avoid unnecessary stress. But deep down, I knew it was because I didn't want to face the risk of everything coming undone. But fate had other plans. The Chicago conference marked the turning point in my life, a moment where lines were crossed and the carefully constructed version of myself began to unravel. It wasn't as though I planned for it to happen, but life has a way of taking you places you never imagined you'd go. James and I had attended the same keynote presentation, sitting just a few rows apart. Throughout the session, I could feel his presence like a magnet pulling me toward him. When it ended, he waited for me near the coffee stand, his signature easy smile lighting up his face as he handed me a cup. "Black, no sugar, right?" he asked, as if he'd committed the detail to memory from some fleeting moment weeks ago. I blinked, surprised. "You remembered?" "Of course I did," he said, his tone so casual it made my chest tighten. "How could I forget someone like you?" His words hung in the air, laden with an implication I wasn't ready to confront. Still, I smiled, trying to play it off. "Flattery will get you everywhere." He laughed, the sound deep and rich. "In that case, let me buy you dinner tonight. It's the least I can do for such brilliant company." I hesitated, the offer catching me off guard, but before I could overthink it, he added, "No pressure, just dinner. We can talk shop. Or not." Something about his tone made it hard to refuse. And maybe, just maybe, I didn't want to refuse. "All right," I said. Dinner. That evening, I stood in front of the mirror in my hotel room, second-guessing my decision. My reflection stared back at me, a mix of excitement and guilt twisting in my chest. This was just dinner, I told myself, nothing more. But deep down, I knew that wasn't entirely true. James had chosen an intimate Italian restaurant tucked away from the bustling downtown streets. The dim lighting and soft music created a warmth that felt both inviting and dangerous. When I arrived, he was already seated, a bottle of red wine on the table. "You look stunning," he said, standing to greet me. His eyes lingered on me for a moment too long, sending a shiver down my spine. "Thank you," I replied, my voice barely steady. "This place is lovely." He poured me a glass of wine, his movements smooth and deliberate. "I thought you'd like it. A hidden gem, much like yourself." I rolled my eyes, though I couldn't stop the smile that tugged at my lips. "Are you always this charming?" "Only when it's deserved." As the night went on, our conversation flowed effortlessly. We talked about work, life, and everything in between. With each passing moment, the walls I had built around myself began to crumble. James had a way of making me feel seen, truly seen, in a way I hadn't felt in years. By the time dessert arrived, I realized how late it had gotten. "I should head back," I said, though the thought of leaving felt like a betrayal to the moment we were sharing. James nodded, but there was a flicker of disappointment in his eyes. "Let me walk you to your hotel." I hesitated, but agreed. After all, it was only a short walk. What could go wrong? The air outside was crisp, the city alive with the hum of nightlife. As we strolled toward my hotel, James kept close, his arm occasionally brushing against mine. It was a small gesture, but it sent my heart racing. When we reached the entrance, I turned to face him. "Thank you for tonight. I had a wonderful time." So did I, he said, his voice soft. He took a step closer, the space between us shrinking. You're incredible, you know that? Ah, James, I started, unsure of what to say, but before I could finish, he reached out and tucked a stray strand of hair behind my ear, his fingers lingering against my cheek. The world seemed to pause, the noise of the city fading into the background. His eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a pull I couldn't resist. I shouldn't, I whispered, the words catching in my throat. But you want to, he said, his voice barely audible. And he was right. The next thing I knew, his lips were on mine. The kiss was electric, a rush of heat and desire that left me breathless. For a moment, I forgot about everything. Daniel, my life back home, the guilt that had been gnawing at me. All that existed was James and the way he made me feel alive. When we finally pulled apart, I stared at him, my heart pounding in my chest. I can't do this. He nodded, his expression understanding but unwavering. I get it, but you don't have to decide anything right now. With that, he stepped back, giving me space to breathe. Good night, he said, his smile tinged with something bittersweet. And then he was gone, leaving me to wrestle with the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside me. I barely slept that night. My mind replayed the kiss over and over, a mix of exhilaration and shame coursing through me. By morning, I had convinced myself it was a mistake, a moment of weakness that would never happen again. But when I saw James at the conference later that day, the way he smiled at me made it clear that he wasn't letting go that easily. During a break between sessions, he cornered me in a quiet hallway. About last night, he began, his voice low. I meant what I said. You don't have to decide anything. But I'd be lying if I said I didn't want to see you again. James, this is complicated, I said, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. I'm married. I know, he said, his gaze steady. But are you happy? The question hit me like a punch to the gut. I opened my mouth to respond, but found I couldn't. Was I happy? The truth was, I didn't know anymore. Before I could answer, he stepped closer, his voice soft but firm. I'm not asking for anything more than your time, just think about it. And with that, he walked away, leaving me alone with the weight of his word. That night, I sat in my hotel room, staring at my phone. My thumb hovered over James's number, the internal battle raging within me. Every logical part of me screamed to delete his contact, to end this before it began. But the part of me that craved connection, that longed to feel alive again, couldn't let go. Finally, I sent him a text, dinner again tomorrow. His reply came almost instantly. I'll pick the plate. As I set my phone down, a mix of excitement and dread coursed through me. I had crossed a line, and there was no going back. The next dinner with James wasn't just a repeat of our first meeting. It was an escalation. He chose a secluded rooftop restaurant, the kind of place where dim candlelight flickered against the city skyline and privacy felt intoxicatingly deliberate. As soon as I saw him waiting at the corner table, his sharp suit perfectly tailored and his easy smile aimed at me, I knew I was in trouble. The evening played out like a dream, or maybe a fantasy I had been too afraid to admit I wanted. James was attentive, charming, and disarmingly confident. He didn't ask about Daniel this time, nor did he press me for answers I wasn't ready to give. Instead, he focused on me, my achievements, my frustrations, my desires. It was thrilling and terrifying to feel so seen, so understood. As we finished our second bottle of wine, he reached across the table and brushed his fingers against mine. It was such a small gesture, but it sent a jolt through me. My breath hitched as he leaned forward, his voice low and intimate. You know this doesn't have to end here, he said, his gaze locked onto mine. I don't mean just tonight. I mean us. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that this was reckless and dangerous, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I let him take my hand and lead me out of the restaurant. The air was cool and crisp, but all I could feel was the heat between us as he hailed a cab and gave the driver the address of his hotel. The affair began in earnest that night, and from that point on, it consumed me. James and I became experts in secrecy, crafting a delicate dance of stolen moments and whispered conversations. He would book meetings in cities where he knew I'd be traveling for work. I'd invent excuses, late nights at the office, impromptu work dinners, to cover for our rendezvous. Our meetings were a whirlwind of passion and intensity, each encounter leaving me more exhilarated and more guilty than the last. James knew how to make me feel like the only woman in the world, and I became addicted to the way he looked at me, touched me, and spoke to me as if I were the most fascinating creature he'd ever known. But the double life wasn't without its challenges. There were close calls, moments that nearly unraveled everything. Like the time James sent me flowers at the office, a beautiful bouquet of roses with a card that read, "For the only reason I look forward to Monday meetings." My assistant brought them into my office, grinning knowingly, and for a heart-stopping moment, I thought she might ask who they were from. I mumbled something about a client and quickly shoved the card into my desk drawer. Another time, Daniel noticed a faint mark on my neck after a particularly heated night with James. "What's that?" he asked, frowning as he tilted my chin to get a better look. I froze, scrambling for an explanation. "Oh, must be from my curling iron," I said with a nervous laugh. "You know how clumsy I am." Daniel didn't look entirely convinced, but he let it go. Still, the moment left me shaken. I couldn't ignore the growing risks of what I was doing, but I also couldn't bring myself to stop. The affair wasn't just about the physical connection, it was about the escape. James offered me a life that felt exciting and carefree, a sharp contrast to the monotony of my marriage. With him, I could forget about the bills, the deadlines, the quiet loneliness that had settled into my relationship with Daniel. But as thrilling as it was, the double life began to take its toll. There were nights when I'd lie awake next to Daniel, my mind replaying the hours I'd spent with James. The guilt would creep in, a cold and unwelcome companion, whispering reminders of the vows I had broken and the lies I had told. And yet, I couldn't let go. Every time I thought about ending things, James would find a way to pull me back in, a text message at just the right moment, a spontaneous trip planned around my schedule, a lingering look that promised everything I didn't know I needed. "You're addicted to me," he said one night as we lay tangled in the sheets of his hotel room. His voice was teasing, but there was an edge of truth to his words. "Don't flatter yourself," I replied, though my smile gave me away. He chuckled, brushing a strand of hair from my face. "You could walk away if you wanted to, but you won't." I hated how right he was. As the affair continued, my relationship with Daniel grew increasingly strained. He began to notice the subtle changes in me, the way I'd pull away from his touch, the way I'd dodge his questions about my day. One evening, as we sat across from each other at the dinner table, he set down his fork and looked at me with an intensity that made my stomach turn. "Is there something you're not telling me?" he asked. "What do you mean?" I replied, my voice too casual, too rehearsed. "I don't know," he said, his eyes searching mine. "You've just seemed different lately, distant." I forced a laugh, trying to deflect. "Work's been crazy. You know how it is." He nodded, but I could tell he wasn't satisfied with my answer. And why should he be? I wasn't even satisfied with it. The turning point came during a weekend trip James and I planned under the guise of a work retreat. We spent 2 blissful days at a secluded cabin, far from the prying eyes of the world. It felt like an alternate reality, a fantasy where we could be together without the constraints of our real lives. But as we sat by the fireplace on our last night, sipping wine and watching the flames dance, James broke the spell. "Do you ever think about what it would be like?" he asked, his voice soft but serious. What would be like, I asked, though I already knew. Us, without all of this. He gestured vaguely, as if to encompass the secrecy, the lies, the complicated web we had woven around ourselves. I didn't know how to answer. Part of me wanted to tell him that I thought about it all the time, that I fantasized about a life where we didn't have to hide. But another part of me knew it wasn't that simple. I had a life, a marriage, a career, and dismantling all of it for James felt like a gamble I wasn't sure I was ready to take. "I don't know," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. James studied me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Well," he said, his tone tinged with resignation, "just think about it." When I returned home, I found Daniel waiting for me in the living room. His face was drawn, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. "We need to talk," he said, his voice heavy. My heart sank. I knew this conversation had been coming, but I wasn't ready for it. "About what?" I asked, feigning innocence. He hesitated, as if searching for the right words. "About us, about everything." As he spoke, I felt the weight of my choices pressing down on me. The double life I had built was beginning to crack, and I had no idea how much longer I could hold it together. The award ceremony was supposed to be the pinnacle of my career, a celebration of everything I had worked so hard to achieve. The prestigious event brought together the brightest minds in my field, a night to shine under the spotlight of success. I had envisioned it as a triumphant moment, but I never anticipated how quickly it would unravel into The ballroom was breathtakingly elegant, with crystal chandeliers casting golden light over the sea of impeccably dressed attendees. The air buzzed with excitement as I arrived, my gown flowing around me like liquid silver. I had spent hours preparing for this night, meticulously crafting the image of perfection, but beneath the polished exterior, I was a mess of nerves. Not because of the ceremony, but because of who would be in the room. James had insisted on coming. I wouldn't miss it for the world, he had said, with that disarming smile that made it impossible to argue. His confidence unnerved me, especially when I reminded him that Daniel didn't know he existed. "Relax," James had said, brushing off my concerns. "It's a big crowd. What are the chances he'll even notice me?" The chances, as it turned out, were devastatingly high. The evening began smoothly enough. I mingled with colleagues, sipped champagne, and pretended everything was fine. James arrived shortly after I did, his presence electrifying the room in a way that only I seemed to notice. He looked devastatingly handsome in his tailored suit, and the way he glanced at me from across the room sent a shiver down my spine. I tried to ignore him, focusing instead on the task at hand, networking, smiling, and being the perfect professional. But then Daniel walked in. I hadn't invited him. In fact, I had deliberately avoided telling him about the ceremony, certain it was safer that way. But one of my coworkers, unaware of my carefully constructed lies, must have extended the invitation on my behalf. When I saw him enter the ballroom, my heart stopped. He was dressed sharply, his usual confidence radiating from him as he scanned the crowd, and then his eyes landed on me. A warm smile spread across his face as he made his way toward me, and I felt a rush of panic. My mind raced as I tried to figure out how to keep him away from James, but before I could think of an excuse to slip away, he was by my side, leaning in to kiss my cheek. "You look stunning," he said, his voice filled with genuine admiration. "Daniel," I said, forcing a smile, "what are you doing here?" "Your coworker Carol mentioned it at the office. I thought I'd surprise you." His smile faltered slightly. "I hope that's okay." "Of course." I lied, my stomach twisting into knots. It's just such a busy night. I didn't think you'd want to come. I wouldn't miss it, he said, his gaze steady. I'm so proud of you. His words should have filled me with gratitude, but instead they felt like a noose tightening around my neck. I glanced around the room, desperate to locate James before Daniel did, but James was already watching us, his expression unreadable as he stood at the edge of the crowd. When our eyes met, he raised his glass in a silent toast, his smile small but knowing. I turned back to Daniel, my heart pounding. Why don't you get a drink? I'll be right over. Daniel nodded, oblivious to my growing panic. Sure, don't take too long. As soon as he walked away, I made a beeline for James. What are you doing? I hissed, pulling him aside. Enjoying the evening, he said, his tone maddeningly calm. Relax, no one knows. My husband is here, I snapped, my voice low but urgent. You need to leave. Now. James raised an eyebrow, clearly amused by my panic. I'm not going anywhere. I came here to support you. This isn't about support, I said through gritted teeth. It's about discretion. Discretion, he repeated, his tone dripping with sarcasm. You're the one who invited this double life, remember? If you can't handle it, maybe you shouldn't have started it. His words stung, but before I could respond, Daniel's voice cut through the tension. Everything okay here? I froze, my heart leaping into my throat as I turned to face him. Daniel stood just a few feet away, his expression curious but cautious. He glanced between James and me, his brow furrowing slightly. Yes, I said quickly, forcing a smile. Daniel, this is James Carter. He's a colleague. James extended his hand, his smile easy and confident. It's a pleasure to meet you. Daniel hesitated for a fraction of a second before shaking his hand. Likewise. So, how do you two know each other? We've collaborated on a few projects, James said smoothly. Your wife is brilliant. It's been an honor working with her. Daniel nodded, though his expression remained guarded. She certainly is. The tension in the air was palpable, and I could feel my carefully constructed facade beginning to crack. I tried to steer the conversation away, but the damage was already done. Daniel wasn't stupid. He could sense that something was off, even if he didn't yet have the words to name it. The ceremony itself was a blur. I was called to the stage to accept my award, the crowd erupting into applause as I stepped into the spotlight. But all I could think about was the two men sitting in the audience, both watching me with vastly different expressions. Daniel's face was tight with suspicion, his jaw clenched as he clapped politely. James, on the other hand, looked almost smug, as if he were daring me to acknowledge him. As I delivered my acceptance speech, my hands trembled and my voice wavered. I could feel the weight of their gazes, the truth hanging in the air like a storm cloud. When I finished, the applause was deafening, but it felt hollow. Backstage, I took a moment to collect myself, my hands gripping the edges of a table as I tried to steady my breathing. But my reprieve was short-lived. When I returned to the reception area, I found Daniel and James standing together, locked in conversation. My stomach dropped. As I approached, Daniel turned to me, his expression unreadable. James was just telling me about one of your projects, he said, his voice carefully neutral. Was he? I said, my voice barely steady. Yes, Daniel said, his eyes narrowing slightly. You've been working quite closely, haven't you? I glanced at James, who was watching me with an infuriatingly calm demeanor. We've had some overlap, I said vaguely, avoiding Daniel's gaze. Daniel stared at me for a long moment, his eyes searching mine. We should go, he said finally, his tone clipped. It's getting late. Of course, I said, my heart pounding. I didn't dare look at James as I followed Daniel out of the ballroom. The car ride home was silent, the tension so thick it was suffocating. I could feel the questions brewing in Daniel's mind, the storm I had tried so hard to avoid now inevitable. When we pulled into the driveway, he cut the engine but didn't get out of the car. Instead, he turned to me, his expression hard and unyielding. "Who is he really?" he asked, his voice low but firm. I opened my mouth to deny it, to tell him he was imagining things, but the words wouldn't come. The lies that had sustained me for so long were crumbling, and for the first time I realized there was no way out. The car was steeped in a heavy, oppressive silence, broken only by Daniel's steady breathing. His question hung in the air, unanswered, as I searched for something, anything, to say that wouldn't lead to the total collapse of everything I'd built. But his eyes were locked onto mine, sharp and unyielding, and I knew there was no evading the truth this time. "Who is he really?" he repeated, his voice harder now, tinged with the anger I knew was simmering just beneath the surface. I tried to steady my trembling hands, gripping the edges of my clutch as if it could somehow anchor me. "Daniel, I don't know what you're talking about." His jaw tightened, and he let out a hollow laugh, shaking his head. "Don't insult me, all right? I'm not stupid. I saw the way he looked at you tonight, and I saw the way you looked at him." He leaned closer, his voice dropping into a dangerous calm. "So, tell me the truth. Who is he?" "I told you," I stammered, the words tumbling out unconvincingly. "He's just a colleague. We've worked together on a few projects, that's all." Daniel's eyes flashed with something between anger and hurt. "A colleague? Really? Then why were you whispering with him like he was your dirty little secret? Why did he look at me like I was the idiot in the room?" His voice rose, cracking with emotion. "Do you think I'm blind? Do you think I haven't noticed how distant you've been? How you've been pulling away from me for months?" "Daniel, stop," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "You're overthinking this." "Am I?" He slammed his hands against the steering wheel, making me jump. "God damn it, just tell me the truth. Are you having an affair?" The question hit me like a physical blow, stealing the breath from my lungs. I stared at him, frozen, the weight of his words crashing over me like a tidal wave. This was it, the moment I had been dreading, the moment I could no longer avoid. My voice faltered, and I felt tears pricking at the corners of my eyes. "Daniel, it's not what you think." "Is exactly what I think," he said, his voice shaking with barely contained fury. "Don't lie to me. Don't you dare lie to me." I pressed my palms against my face, trying to contain the sob that was threatening to escape. "I didn't mean for this to happen," I said finally, my voice muffled and broken. It got out of control." Daniel's expression shifted, the anger in his eyes replaced by something far worse: betrayal. He leaned back in his seat, staring at me like he didn't recognize the woman sitting next to him. "How long?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "Daniel, please." "How long?" he demanded, his voice rising again. "I deserve to know." I hesitated, the truth lodging itself in my throat like a jagged piece of glass. "A few months," I admitted finally, my voice trembling. "It wasn't supposed to. I never wanted to hurt you." He laughed bitterly, running a hand through his hair. "You never wanted to hurt me? That's rich. Do you have any idea what you've done? Are you all right?" "I know," I said, tears streaming down my face. "I know, and I'm sorry." "I'm sorry doesn't fix this," he said, his voice cracking. "Sorry doesn't erase the fact that you betrayed me, that you lied to me, that you—" He trailed off, his hands clenching into fists. "God, I trusted you." I reached out to touch his arm, but he flinched away, his expression hardening. "Don't," he said, "just don't." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence was suffocating, filled with the weight of everything I couldn't take back. I wanted to say something, to explain myself, but I didn't even know where to begin. How could I justify the choices I had made? How could I ask for forgiveness when I wasn't sure I deserved it? Finally, Daniel exhaled, his shoulders slumping as if the fight had drained out of him. "I need to know," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Do you love him?" The question took me by surprise, and I felt my chest tighten. Did I love James? I cared for him, yes. I was drawn to him, intoxicated by the way he made me feel. But love? That was a word I hadn't dared to confront, a question I had avoided asking myself. "I don't know," I said honestly, my voice barely audible. "I don't know what I feel." Daniel shook his head, his lips curling into a bitter smile. "That's not an answer." "It's the truth," I said, my voice breaking. "I'm so sorry, Daniel. I never wanted this to happen. I never wanted to hurt you." "Then why did you do it?" he asked, his voice rising again. "Why wasn't I enough for you?" His words hit me like a punch to the gut, and I felt the tears spill over again. "It wasn't about you," I said, my voice trembling. "It was about me. I felt invisible. I felt alone, and James, he made me feel alive." Daniel let out a hollow laugh, shaking his head. "Alive? That's your excuse? You threw away our marriage because you wanted to feel alive?" "I didn't throw it away," I shot back, my voice rising in desperation. "I was lost, Daniel. I was lonely, and I didn't know how to fix it. I didn't know how to fix us." "And you thought cheating was the answer?" he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "You thought lying to me, sneaking around behind my back was going to make things better?" "No," I said, my voice breaking. "I don't know what I thought. I wasn't thinking. I was desperate." He stared at me for a long moment, his eyes filled with pain and disbelief. Finally, he shook his head, his voice cold and distant. "I don't even know who you are anymore." "Daniel, please," I begged, reaching for his hand. "We can fix this. We can—" "No," he said, cutting me off. "You don't get to decide that. You don't get to decide anything anymore." He opened the car door and stepped out, slamming it shut behind him. I watched as he walked toward the house, his shoulders hunched and his steps heavy. The weight of what I had done pressed down on me, suffocating and inescapable. For the first time, I realized that I might have destroyed everything: my marriage, my life, and any chance of redemption. The next few days passed in a haze of silence and shattered routines. Daniel barely spoke to me, and when he did, it was only out of necessity. The warm familiarity of our home had been replaced with a cold, tense atmosphere that seemed to seep into every corner. He spent his nights in the guest room, and each time I walked past the closed door, my chest tightened with the weight of what I had done. I tried to reach out to him, to bridge the growing distance, but every attempt was met with cold indifference. One evening, I stood outside the guest room, my hand hovering over the doorknob as I debated whether to knock. The words I wanted to say churned in my mind, but I didn't know how to make him believe me. Finally, I lowered my hand and walked away. The guilt was relentless, an ever-present ache that gnawed at me day and night. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. All I could think about was the look on Daniel's face when he confronted me, the pain and betrayal etched into every line. I wanted to rewind time to undo everything, but the damage had already been done. James called several times, but I couldn't bring myself to answer. Each time his name lit up my phone screen, I felt a mix of longing and shame. I knew I needed to end things with him, but even that felt like a betrayal. Another wound to inflict on someone who had, in his own way, cared for me. A week after the awards ceremony, Daniel finally broke the silence. It was a Sunday morning, and I was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee I had no intention of drinking. He walked in, his expression unreadable, and sat across from me. "We need to talk," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. I nodded, my heart pounding. I know. He took a deep breath, his gaze fixed on the table instead of me. I've been thinking about this a lot. About us, about what happened. Daniel, let me finish, he interrupted, his tone firm but not unkind. I don't know if I can forgive you for this, at least not right now. But I also know that this didn't happen in a vacuum. We both let our marriage fall apart. I wasn't there for you the way I should have been, and I see that now. His words surprised me, and for a moment I didn't know how to respond. Daniel, it wasn't your fault, I said softly. What I did, that was my choice, my mistake. You didn't deserve it. No, he said, finally meeting my eyes. I didn't. But that doesn't change the fact that we got here together. And if there's any hope of fixing this, we need to be honest with each other, completely honest. I swallowed hard, the weight of his words settling over me. You're right, I said, my voice trembling. I'll do whatever it takes, Daniel. I want us to have a chance. He nodded slowly, his expression still guarded. Then we need space. I can't just pretend everything's fine. I need time to figure out if I can move past this. His words felt like a blow, but I knew he was right. Okay, I said, my voice barely audible. If that's what you need. Daniel packed a bag that evening and left to stay with his brother. As I watched his car pull out of the driveway, a wave of despair washed over me. I felt like I was watching my life crumble before my eyes, powerless to stop it. But at the same time, I knew this was my chance, perhaps my only chance, to make things right. The first step was ending things with James. I called him the next day, my hands trembling as I held the phone to my ear. He answered on the second ring, his voice warm and familiar. Hey, you, I was starting to think you were avoiding me. James, I said, my voice breaking slightly. We need to talk. There was a pause, and then his tone shifted. This sounds serious. It is, I said, taking a deep breath. I can't do this anymore. I can't keep lying to Daniel. I can't keep living like this. Are you breaking up with me? He asked, his voice calm but edged with disbelief. I don't even know if that's the right word for what we were, I said, tears streaming down my face. But yes, I'm ending this. I have to. James was silent for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice was softer. I knew this day would come, he said. I just hoped it wouldn't be so soon. I'm sorry, I whispered. You've been so good to me, James, but I can't keep hurting the people I care about. And what about you, he asked, his tone tinged with sadness. Don't you deserve to be happy? Maybe, I said, but not like this. He sighed, and I could hear the disappointment in his voice. I hope he's worth it. It's not about him, I said. It's about me, and I need to fix my life. Goodbye, then, he said, and the line went dead. I set the phone down, my chest heaving as I sobbed into my hands. It felt like a piece of me had been ripped away, but for the first time in months, I also felt a strange sense of relief. The lies were over, the hiding was over. Now, all that was left was the hard work of rebuilding. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into therapy, determined to understand the choices that had led me to this point. I confronted the loneliness, the resentment, and the fear that had been festering inside me for years. It was painful and uncomfortable, but it was also necessary. For the first time, I began to see myself clearly, not as a victim of circumstance, but as someone who had the power to change. Daniel and I spoke occasionally, our conversations measured and careful. He remained distant, but there were moments when I saw glimpses of the man I had fallen in love with. He agreed to attend couples therapy with me, though he made it clear that it was only the first step, not a guarantee. We'll see where it goes, he said. his voice cautious but not unkind. That was all I could ask for. The road ahead was uncertain, and I knew there were no guarantees, but for the first time in a long time, I felt a glimmer of hope. The life I had built with Daniel was worth fighting for, and I was ready to do whatever it took to earn his trust again. As I stood in the empty kitchen one evening, staring out the window at the fading light, I allowed myself a small, fragile smile. This wasn't the ending I had imagined for myself, but it wasn't the end either. It was a beginning, a chance to rebuild, to heal, and to rediscover who I was and who I wanted to be. For the first time in months, I felt a spark of something I thought I had lost: hope. The days without Daniel felt long and empty. The house seemed quieter without his presence, the absence of his familiar routines amplifying the weight of my solitude. I found myself wandering through the rooms, pausing in front of the small signs of the life we had built together: the framed wedding photo on the mantel, the faint scent of his cologne lingering in the closet, the half-finished puzzle we had abandoned on the dining table months ago. Every object seemed to tell a story, a reminder of what I stood to lose. In the stillness, I had no choice but to face myself. There were no distractions, no excuses to hide behind. The truth of my action sat heavy on my chest, an unrelenting ache that I carried with me everywhere. I had spent so long blaming Daniel for the distance between us, convincing myself that his workaholism and emotional absence were the reasons I had strayed. But the longer I sat with my thoughts, the more I realized how much of the blame was mine. Yes, Daniel had made mistakes. He had been distant, preoccupied, and, at times, oblivious to my needs. But I had made no effort to communicate my unhappiness. Instead of confronting our problems together, I had sought solace in someone else. I had taken the easy way out, choosing temptation over honesty. That realization cut deep. It wasn't just Daniel I had betrayed, it was myself, the woman I had always believed myself to be: strong, loyal, principled. Felt like a stranger now. And yet, as painful as it was to confront, I knew it was the only way forward. If I wanted to rebuild my life, I had to start by taking responsibility for the choices that had led me here. Therapy became my lifeline. I met with my therapist twice a week, delving into the patterns and insecurities that had shaped my decisions. It was a grueling process, peeling back layers of guilt, shame, and fear to uncover the deeper truths about myself. I had always prided myself on my independence, my ability to handle anything life threw at me. But beneath that facade was a woman who was terrified of vulnerability, who equated asking for help with weakness. "You've spent so much time trying to be everything to everyone," my therapist said during one session. "But who are you when you're alone with yourself, when you're not performing for the world?" I didn't have an answer. The question haunted me long after the session ended. I began journaling, pouring my thoughts onto the pages late into the night. I wrote about my marriage, my affair, my childhood, and the ways I had learned to bury my emotions instead of confronting them. The more I wrote, the more I began to understand the root of my unhappiness. It wasn't just about Daniel or James or the choices I had made. It was about the ways I had neglected myself, the ways I had allowed my fears to dictate my life. Daniel and I continued our couples therapy sessions, though progress was slow. He was guarded, his trust in me shattered, and I didn't blame him. Each session felt like walking a tightrope, every word and gesture carefully measured. But there were moments of connection, brief flashes of the bond we once shared, like the time he admitted, through clenched teeth, that he missed me. "It's hard," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I want to hate you for what you did, but I can't. I still love you, and that's the worst part." Hearing those words broke me in a way I hadn't expected. I had convinced myself that he would never forgive me, that I had destroyed everything beyond repair. To know that he still loved me, despite everything, was both a comfort and a burden. It made me want to fight harder, to prove that I was worthy of that love. One evening, as I was tidying up the kitchen, I found myself staring at a photo of us from our honeymoon. We were standing on a beach, the sun setting behind us, our smiles wide and unguarded. I traced the edges of the frame with my fingers, remembering how happy we had been in that moment. It felt like a lifetime ago. I wondered if we could ever find our way back to that version of ourselves. Could we rediscover the joy, the intimacy, the partnership that had once defined our marriage? Or had I damaged it beyond repair? My thoughts drifted to James, to the moments we had shared and the ways he had filled the void in my life. There was a part of me that would always be grateful to him, not for the affair itself, but for what it had forced me to confront. He had been a catalyst, a mirror reflecting the cracks I had been too afraid to see. But as much as I had cared for him, I knew now that he was never the answer. He was an escape, not a solution. The real work, the hard, messy, necessary work, was here, in this house, with this man I had once promised to love forever. One night, Daniel called me. It was late, and I was curled up on the couch with a book I wasn't really reading. My heart leapt when I saw his name on the screen, a flicker of hope igniting in my chest. "Hi," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Hi," he replied, his tone softer than it had been in weeks. "I was just thinking about you." My breath caught. "I think about you all the time," I admitted, my voice trembling. "I miss you." There was a long pause, and I could hear him exhale on the other end of the line. "I miss you too," he said finally. "But I don't know if that's enough." Tears pricked at my eyes, and I nodded even though he couldn't see me. "I know," I said. "I know I have to earn your trust again. And I'm willing to do whatever it takes, Daniel. I'll wait as long as you need." He didn't respond right away, and for a moment I thought the call had dropped, but then he said, "I don't want to throw away what we had. I don't know if I can forgive you yet, but I want to try." Those words were enough. They were more than I deserved, but they were a lifeline, a glimmer of hope in the darkness. And for the first time, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back to each other. The reflection wasn't over. It would take months, maybe years, to fully untangle the threads of what had happened and rebuild the trust that had been broken. But I was ready to do the work, to face the truths I had spent so long avoiding. I didn't know where the road would lead, but I knew one thing for certain. I wouldn't make the same mistakes again. I wouldn't take the easy way out, and whatever came next, I would meet it with honesty, courage, and a commitment to being better, not just for Daniel, but for myself. Months passed, and life slowly began to take shape again, though it was different from what it had been before. The wounds of the affair were still fresh, but Daniel and I were working toward something. Not the life we had before, but something new, something rebuilt from the ground up. He returned home cautiously, his bags sitting in the hallway for days, as if he was unsure whether he truly belonged there. We navigated our days carefully, like two people learning how to walk all over again. Every interaction carried the weight of unspoken questions, but with time, those questions started to find their answers. One night, as we sat on the back porch watching the sunset, Daniel broke the silence. "Do you regret it?" he asked, his voice steady but soft. I hesitated, knowing how much the answer mattered. "Yes," I said finally, "not just because it hurt you, but because I lost sight of who I wanted to be. I regret the lies, the pain, all of it, but I don't regret what it taught me. It made me realize how much I need to fight for us." He looked at me for a long time, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he nodded. I'm not ready to forgive you completely, he admitted, but I'm willing to try. That's all I can promise. And that's more than I deserve, I replied, tears filling my eyes. Thank you for giving me this chance. From that point on, things weren't perfect, but they were real. We learned how to talk to each other again, how to share our fears and hopes without fear of judgment. Couples therapy became a lifeline, a space where we could unpack the hurt and find ways to heal together. It wasn't easy, but it was worth it. James faded from my life like a chapter closing. I didn't block his number or delete his messages. I simply stopped looking at them. Eventually, his texts stopped coming. I knew he had moved on, and so had I. Whatever feelings I had for him were replaced by gratitude for the lessons learned and the clarity gained. He had been a part of my story, but not the one I wanted to write. One evening, months later, Daniel and I attended another work event together. It was a small gathering, nothing like the fateful award ceremony, but significant nonetheless. As we walked into the room, hand in hand, I felt the weight of what we had endured, but also the strength of what we had rebuilt. During the toast, Daniel leaned over and whispered, "I'm proud of you." The words were simple, but they meant everything. For the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful, not just for our marriage, but for the person I was becoming. Life was far from perfect, but it was ours, and that, I realized, was enough. As the night went on, I allowed myself a small, quiet smile. The past would always be a part of me, but it didn't define me. What defined me was the choice to fight, to heal, and to hope again. And for the first time in months, I felt at peace.